All right, are we ready? Yeah. Okay, so before I say anything, I want to get this out of the way. I'm going to take a picture. So I want everybody to wave in a second. Now, anybody that might be on, I might post this on social media, so any of you all that might be on the Dodge, Dr. Part, you may want to just cover your eyes. So, all right, let me hold up the camera, everybody wave. All right, there you go. A couple of things. Next week is 4th of July week, so that means, of course, fried chicken. So you better get your reservation in. It's probably going to be a big dinner night next door in the Great Hall. We got a great show tonight, but first, I was thinking about this last couple of days with this just brutal heat. Now, look what God did. He gave us a little rain this afternoon, turned it down to like 79 as I was driving over here. But these last few days have been pretty unbearable. And whenever that happens, I always try to picture something in my mind that gets my mind off the heat. And this always does it. So just about everybody here, I'm sure, knows what that is. But it's pretty rare it looks like that. And Jackson and I were trying to think when that was when I took this picture. 2010, 2011, 2012. All I remember is I had the shop in Snyder Plaza, and I was the only one there that day. The only one there. They weren't even open next door to me at Peggy Sue for me to have lunch. So anyway, I walked out and took the picture of the fountain, and it always comes up when it gets this hot outside, and it makes me think that sooner or later, cool weather will get here. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm going to introduce Reverend Cottrell King. We're excited to have him tonight to welcome us. And then he's going to introduce Susan Wilson, who will introduce our speaker. Oh, by the way, I'll say this again at the end. We've got books upstairs. And so as soon as the review's over, Richard's going to whisk Kathleen upstairs to sit and sign books, so if you want to get a book, there's plenty up there after the show. Reverend King?
Thank you. Good evening. How's everybody doing today? I want to try that again because I think you feel like you're in the rain right now. Good evening. Now that's more like it. Thank you. My name is Reverend Cottrell King. I am the campus pastor for the Table that's located in the Deep Ellum area. And I just would like to welcome you tonight on behalf of Highland Park United Methodist Church, the clergy staff, and the staff. So we welcome you here tonight, and we just hope that you just open up your hearts, your minds, your souls, and just receive a word. You don't know, we can always receive a word no matter what we're doing or what we're listening to. Amen? Amen. All right, let us pray. Oh, gracious God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you for bringing us together this evening, God. We thank you for protecting us and watching over us. Now, God, we just pray that you would just open us up, open up our minds, our hearts, and our souls, and let us receive. So we pray for the speaker tonight, God. Be with her, bless her, use her, but most of all, just relax us that we can receive a word. And these things we ask in your Son, Jesus' name, and all of the people of God said together, hallelujah. 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 Thank God. And amen. I would like to invite up Susan Wilson.
Kathleen Kent is a New York Times best-selling author and an Edgar Award nominee for her contemporary crime trilogy, The Dime, The Burn, and The Pledge. Ms. Kent is also the author of 3 award-winning historical novels, The Heretic's Daughter, The Traitor's Wife, and The Outcasts. Her newest novel, Black Wolf, an international spy thriller, was published February 2023 and has received glowing reviews in both the US and the UK. She has written short stories and essays for D Magazine, Texas Monthly, and Lit Hub, and has been published in the crime anthology Dallas Noir. In March 2020, she was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters for her contribution to Texas literature. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kathleen Kent.
Thank you. Do I need it with this? Thank you, Susan, for that introduction and to the Rejebian reading series. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight. I was here last year to do a presentation on my first novel, The Heretic's Daughter, which was based on my 9 times great-grandmother, Martha Carrier, who was hanged as a witch in Salem in 1692. And that first book, and I never had anything published before, and I was in my 50s before that book was published, launched my writing career. Within the first week, it hit the New York Times bestseller list. It's now published in 17 countries, and I still get emails from people either claiming to have common descendancy from the Carrier family or from one of the judges saying, mea culpa, we sentenced your great-grandmother to death. And I try to assure them that no hard feelings at all, mostly. So after The Heretic's Daughter, I published a sequel called The Traitor's Wife, and then a book about Texas after the Civil War called The Outcasts, and then came 3 works of contemporary crime, which did very well. And in thinking about the book that I wanted to do to follow up, which ended up being Black Wolf, was a book that had been very close to my work experience. But, you know, I was, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, I was the duck and cover generation. In grade school, we had drills where we hid under our desk in case the evil empire fired nuclear weapons at us, and of course, we'd be kept safe and sound under our little desks, right? So I grew up, you know, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, Russia, the great state of Russia, which covers 11 time zones, was for me the evil empire. It was our #1 enemy. And I love to read, and I cut my teeth on international spy novels, Jean Le Carré being one of my favorites. And for a long time, that Cold War essence sort of seeped into the subconscious of Western Europe and the American psyche. And they were to be feared greatly for many, many decades. And so even though I had been thinking about writing Black Wolf, I wasn't sure that people would find Russian espionage interesting because through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, it appeared, at least there was a glimmer of hope that Russia would be our ally. They started making overtures to the Western marketplace. Trade started. We started having talks of cooperation. And so I thought, well, you know, our enemies have focused themselves into other parts of the world, and I wasn't sure that a Russian spy novel would be relevant. Well, when I finished the first draft, I sent it in to my publisher 1 week before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. So suddenly what I was writing about, and it's based on my experience, very personal experience, which I'm going to talk about tonight. First, I'm going to give some background, how I came to write Black Wolf, and some of the things in the novel. It is fictionalized, but there's a lot in the novel that I experienced directly. So, to back up, 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and that surprised everyone, including American intelligence. We knew that there were grumblings a civilian uprising. We just didn't know, we being the Department of Defense and our allied intelligence agencies, had no idea how quickly it would come. And almost overnight, people, sometimes with their bare hands, were tearing down the Berlin Wall. And suddenly, there was a whole new opportunity to mend fences, to smooth over old ill feelings. There was just one problem. The Congress, the US government, and the Department of Defense became aware that in 1989, the Soviet Union, which was starting to break up very shortly after that, had 27,000 nuclear warheads. 27,000 nuclear warheads, and tons of biological and chemical weapons. And when Senator Sam Nunn went to the Soviet Union, it was still the Soviet Union in 1990, he became aware in a very alarming way that through all of the chaos, the Soviet Union was breaking apart, supply lines were breaking down, money, people being paid, the military wasn't being paid. Who was minding the store? And he became aware of the fact that some of these silos that had actively armed nuclear warheads were unmanned. No one was minding the store. And that some of these warehouses of biological weapons had little padlocks on the door. No guards. They were deserted. So Mikhail Gorbachev, who was very close to being deposed by the hardliners, was reinstated, again by a popular uprising. He's in Moscow. Sam Nunn goes to Moscow. He meets with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he asks him, who's minding the store? Who's watching all of these 27,000 nuclear warheads and tons of these chemical and biological weapons? And Mikhail Gorbachev shrugged and said, "Ya ne znаю," which is, I don't know. That set Sam Nunn's hair on fire. He went back to Washington, and he had a meeting with Dick Cheney, and he said, look, we need to, like the Marshall Plan, we need to raise money from Congress and go in and help these people out of their chaos, because bad actors like Iran and Pakistan are going actively, even as we're speaking, to go in and gather up this fissionable material or the bombs or the chemical weapons. And Cheney said, are you crazy? We just spent, 50 years trying to bring them to their knees. Now that we've destroyed them, you want to give them money? And he, Sam Nunn, and Richard Lugar, a Democrat and a Republican, worked together tirelessly for months to start a groundswell of the Congress and the President and Dick Cheney and everyone involved in the US government on board with the fact that we had an obligation to go in and help stabilize the former Soviet Union, which was, even in the 1990s, was starting to break up into what would become 15 separate republics. So Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar started the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the CTR program. And job number one was to dismantle and deactivate nuclear weapons and to stockpile and get rid of the biological and the chemical weapons. So CTR program, for 10 years, through the 1980s, I worked for a man named Lowell Mintz, who was the chairman of the Commodity Exchange. He had a lot of government contacts, and he was friends with a lot of people in Congress. And he responded to this, and he said, look, what you need are civilian contractors to go in and help negotiate. There was so much mistrust and distrust from military personnel or intelligence agencies that he thought that if civilians could go in and work as a liaison between the US DoD and the Soviet machinery, that we could accomplish quite a bit. So that's, in fact, what we did. I worked for a company. We developed this company called Bielocorp Scientific. Lowell was the chairman, and that's my Russian business card, and I was project manager, and we were one of the first companies to sign an agreement with US Congress, the CTR program, to go first into Belarus and to start the ball rolling on dismantling, shipping out all of these nuclear weapons and closing down and destroying all of the warehousing of all these other weapons. So here I was. I didn't really have any knowledge about the former Soviet Union except what I had read. I didn't really speak the language, although I took some classes in Russian. And I was kind of just thrown into it and just said, do the best you can do. So we traveled there with engineers, with technical people, and with intelligence agencies. Now, I like to say I didn't work for intelligence, CIA, NSA, but I was CIA adjacent, so that my main job was to oversee, was to report, and at that time, I wasn't doing creative writing, because the DoD discourages creative writing in a big way, just the facts, ma'am. So I spent a lot of reporting, and we started the ball rolling. So I was in Belarus, which was still the Belarusian Soviet, part of the Soviet Union in 1990, and we started our program there. Okay, so can we just admire my shoulder pads here? This is 1990. This is working girl, okay? 1990, the man to my left is Lowell Mintz, who was chairman of the Commodity Exchange. He was chairman, and really the visionary to approach the government and say, let us shoulder the burden. Let us go into Belarus and start the ball rolling. And the man standing to my right is Dr. William Bigel. Now, in the book Black Wolf, I write about a man named William Cutler, who was a nuclear physicist, which Dr. Bigel was. He spoke 7 languages. He could play the piano like a concert pianist. One of the most lovely, empathetic human beings I've ever met in my life. He was the survivor of the Holocaust. He lost 14 members of his family to the Holocaust. When he was young, 12 years old or so, he was a little skinny kid, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and he was adopted by a Polish family and was hidden by this Catholic family and survived the Holocaust, even though, because he spoke so many different languages, he was made translator to an SS officer and spent years being terrified that he was going to be discovered at any moment and sent to the camps. So this was how it started, just the 3 of us. And we brought forth other American businessmen. We traveled with intelligence. We traveled with scientists. We traveled with legal experts. So we developed this team, but it started just in 1990, just with the 3 of us. So my first view of Minsk was landing at Minsk 2 Airport. This is picture of Minsk 2 Airport, which from the outside looked like something from the Jetsons. It looks very modern, it looks sleek. You go inside, and there were wires dangling. The luggage belts didn't work. We had to send people out to drag our luggage across the tarmac. Light bulbs were in real short supply, so a lot of the hallways were pitch black. We had to use flashlights to walk through. But this to me was a perfect example of what the Soviet Union had become. A very beautiful or imposing shell on the outside and a complete disaster on the inside. 1990, the Afghan war had broken the back of the Soviet Union, and the civilians were the ones that were suffering the most. Things had been falling apart. People weren't being paid. You couldn't get anything. So when we came to Minsk, things like Post-its and whiteout and paper clips were like diamonds and jewels to them, because the simplest thing they didn't have and they couldn't acquire. This is the GUM department store in Minsk. This is, its sister store was in Moscow. This was built in 1951, and it is the height, I was told, by the guide that drove us into Minsk. This was the height of Stalinist, Soviet, classicist architecture. They're very proud of that. It's very solid. On the inside, it had beautiful mosaic floors. It had beautiful paintings, these gorgeous chandeliers, very elaborate chandeliers, and there was nothing inside because there was nothing being manufactured. It was eerie. You know, you might have a shipment of boots that were all one size, or a shipment of coats that were all one size. It was very eerie and very sad. People would start lining up at dawn, line up around the block so that when the store opened, they could go in and perhaps find something, whatever was there. Oftentimes, there wasn't anything left and they'd have to go home. So things in 1990 were really hard. And that was kind of a shock to me because I always thought about this marvelous, imposing Soviet machinery. And they had put the best of everything into their military, but the civilians were really suffering. This is KGB headquarters. So when we were driving past, I was made aware that every guide, every translator, all of our drivers would be KGB. And they would pretend not to speak English. Some of them would speak English. They'd pretend not to speak English, but they said, be very careful what you say because they all speak English and they're all KGB. So this was a little bit concerning because, we'd read stories about the thumbscrews of the KGB, right? So our driver, Boris, we're driving down. He said, here's GUM department store and here's the Victory Park. And he said, is KGB building, the tallest building in Minsk. And I said, Boris, it's, every building around that area was 4 stories high, just like the KGB building. He said, but from the top floor, you can see all the way to Siberia. Some of the best jokes I heard were from KGB agents. So there was this odd tension. They didn't trust us. We didn't trust them. But we had to start somewhere. And so, slowly but surely, we had to make inroads into visiting their military plants, their laboratories, and it was like pulling teeth, and especially because I was a woman. Now, I had spent 10 years on the floor of the commodity exchange working for the chairman, and I was one of the few females that worked on the floor of the exchange. There were no women traders at that time. There were data analysts, and we had some female lawyers, but I was it. I was the only woman in the room. Here again, all of my colleagues, my American colleagues from the DOD, and certainly my Soviet colleagues were all men. So it was fraught not only because the weight of the Soviet Union was still over our heads. Every phone call we made was bugged. We stayed at the Planyeta Hotel, which I'll show you a picture of, which I talk about in the book. We were told that the way you could tell whether or not it was truly a reflective mirror or a two-way mirror was that you would put your finger up against the reflective surface, and if there was a gap between your finger and the reflection, it was a true mirror. If there was no gap, there was someone behind that pane of glass that was probably recording everything. If we wanted to have a private conversation with our colleagues, we had to walk outside, and of course we were always followed, and we had to stay out of earshot of ears that we didn't want to hear. Inside, in our hotel room, we go into the bathroom and turn on the faucets so we could have a conversation, or in the kitchen, put on a tea kettle, which had a loud whistle, and all of the water faucets on to help create the white noise to buffer the sound, because we were never not watched, followed, or listened to. And it's even when you know that, it's really exhausting after a while to feel that weight. Fortunately, I can say I never saw the inside of the KGB building. I met some KGB officers, highly placed, but fortunately never saw the inside. So this was the Planeta Hotel where we stayed, and I write about this in the book. The Planeta Hotel was built for high-ranking Soviet officials, for athletes. It was supposedly the best of the best. And it had a restaurant, and it had a bar called the Planeta Mir, and they had live music. And let me tell you, you haven't lived until you've heard Tina Turner's Rolling on a River played with accordion and sung in Russian. I mean, that was quite an experience. So the sad thing, though, and it wasn't just Americans. Swiss and German businessmen had started, because the wall had come down, a lot of German businessmen were starting to come in, and that's where they all stayed. And again, I was the only woman there, except for the Planeta Mir, the bar, which was filled with beautiful, intelligent, highly educated prostitutes. Because they couldn't be paid, you know. There were doctors. There was a physicist there that I bet spoke beautiful English in her late 20s. They had families. They could make more in a night than in a month, maybe. And things were so uncertain that they did what they had to do. So I had a real soft spot for the poignant situation that these women found themselves in. And I kind of make homage to some of these women in Black Wolf, because they had no other choice. Typical luxurious hotel room in the Planeta Hotel. This was a single. A double would be 2 of those little beds, side by side. And what was amazing is that the ceilings were really high. They would have elaborate, light fixtures, which oftentimes didn't work. But there's no such word in Russian for quality control. No such word. So you would be staying, sometimes I'd be there in the summer with white nights, and night would be 4 hours long. Sometimes I'd be there in the winter, and I'd wake up and I'd see these little flakes floating in from, where the wall joined the ceiling, and I realized there was a gap. They hadn't caulked the gap in between, and it was like the outside coming into your hotel room. They usually turned the heat off around 10 o'clock at night, and these were freezing cold winters, and not turn the heat on until about 7 o'clock the next morning, and of course no hot water. So I used to prepare when I went to Belarus as though I was going to the Arctic Circle, wearing mukluks and everything like that. The other thing about hotels is that when you first got there, they took your passport. You were met by the manager. They took your passport, and you wouldn't get your passport back until you were escorted to the airport, and they made sure you got on the plane. They had, and this was typical in every Soviet hotel, they had dezhurnayas. There were hall monitors. They were usually older women who sat, we called them hall dragons. They would sit in their little desk. When you left your room, you usually had an old-fashioned key. You handed the dezhurnaya your key, she'd put it on your hook, and she'd glare at you as you walked down to the elevator. But she had a little notebook, and she wrote what time you came in, what time you left, did you have any guests? So again, constantly watched. So one of the things, and I also write about this in the book, I was taken, this is a war memorial in Minsk. It's called Katyn. And Katyn is this very moving memorial to a place, it was a village where all of the villagers were rounded up, and they were put into a barn, and the barn was set on fire. And every one of the villagers, several hundred men, women, and children, were burned alive. Now, the official Soviet story was that it was the Germans. It was the Germans invading soldiers that did this. But when I went to Katyn with one of the scientists, one of the Belarusian scientists that we were working with, said to me in whispered tones, he said, no. It was the Belarusian police working with the Germans that did it. And it was one of the things, the history that I learned over time, that 3 million Belarusians died, some of them of starvation, during World War II. In fact, Russia lost more of its soldiers and citizens than any other country combined during the Second World War. Many of them starved to death. But it was a very, very poignant memorial to a man named Joseph Kaminsky. He was one of the few survivors, and it's Joseph Kaminsky holding his dead son, and it's called Unconquered Man. And that was one of the more touching monuments that I went to there. So this was a historic moment for us because this is when we signed, this was in 1990. The first prime minister that Belarus had when it gained independence was Vyacheslav Kebich, and he's the man sitting there with his hands over his mouth. He was the first prime minister, and that's our American team on the other side, part of our American team, and we signed contracts with the government of Belarus to allow us to come in to start the work of dismantlement. So it was a big moment for us, and as you can see, a lot of women in the room, right? So here is our team, a part of our team. Again, I'm taking the picture. I'm the only woman in the room. Some of you basketball fans, I don't know if you noticed, the tall guy in the back, that's Dave DeBuscher from the Knicks. He was on our team. He wanted to be a part of history making. So he traveled with us. The man to the far left is the head of the Louis Koff Heat and Mass Transfer Institute, which I write about in Black Wolf. So for 4 years, we were in and out of Belarus. We were making progress. In 1994, our old pal, Alexander Lukashenko, was elected president. We didn't realize at the time he was going to be president for life. Bonus points if you can pick out the 2 KGB officers in the room. Up against the wall, the 2 tall guys with a serious expression. So that was my boss, Lowell Mintz, shaking hands, and we really thought that Lukashenko was going to embrace the West. He wanted to embrace commerce. You know, he talked a good game. He started out as a pig farmer, so he brought the agricultural processes into government, evidently piled higher and deeper. So, but that was kind of an historic moment also. So now I've kind of given you a background of what it was like traveling through Belarus. And from 1990 to 1998, I wasn't just in Belarus, I was in Kazakhstan as well, which is a whole other fascinating story. 15% of the world's uranium has come and still continues to come from Kazakhstan. An interesting point that I didn't realize until fairly recently is that when the fissionable, the weapons-grade uranium was shipped to Moscow and turned over to the Department of Defense, we are still powering some of our nuclear plants with degraded weapons uranium from Russia. It was shipped overseas, stored here, and we're still, talk about turning swords into plowshares. We're still using some of that degraded uranium. So to get to the book, Black Wolf, which is fictionalized, the story is of a young CIA agent named Melvina Donlevy. She's on her first assignment, and I really channeled my nervousness and my uncertainty into her first experience. She is CIA. She's working with 3 other agents who have much more experience. She's posing as a secretary, but in fact, she has a very unique talent. She's a super recognizer. And I didn't know, when I was searching for something to imbue my protagonist with, my husband brought an article to me from The Guardian about a woman named Kelly Hersey, who's used by by Scotland Yard because she can look at a photograph of an individual and then watch crowds of people, say in a sports stadium, and pick out that person. Her hit rate is 100%. She's called a super recognizer, and it's nothing that you can develop. It's not like a good backhand at tennis. She was born with it, and Scotland Yard helped to develop and bring it into their solving their criminal cases. So I thought, that's such a unique talent. So I gave Melvina Donlevy that ability to recognize faces. So she is sent by the CIA to see if she can recognize several Iranian scientists who were in Minsk trying to obtain nuclear weapons. And this was a real thing. This was a real event. The reason we ended up going to Kazakhstan was because Tehran had made formal application to open an embassy in Almaty, which was the capital of Kazakhstan at that time. And 50 kilometers north of Almaty was one of these hidden cities which had weapons-grade uranium. And we knew the only reason why they wanted an embassy there was to get their hands on the uranium. So Melvina Donlevy's, her mission was not unlike what our mission was to make sure that bad actors didn't get a hold of this world-ending capability. So she's there, and she becomes the target of Black Wolf, Martin Kavalchuk, who's the head of the Belarusian KGB, this terrifying character, where it said that the only time you'd hear Martin Kavalchuk's footsteps is when he was carrying your coffin. KGB, very, very sinister, but he has a problem. And in the book Black Wolf, so I've got CIA, I've got KGB, and I also have a serial killer. The serial killer in my book I called the Svislak Strangler. He's killing women, he's taking women off the streets. He is based on a real serial killer, Andrei Chikatilo, who was called the Butcher of Rostov. And he killed probably close to 100 women and children over 20 years. He rode the rails and he picked them up. A peculiarity of Soviet law enforcement said, and this was, Stalin famously said, there is no murder in paradise. How many tens of millions of his own countrymen did he kill? But it was believed that someone like a serial killer could only happen in the decadent West, that it was a malignant outgrowth of our decadence in the West. So they kept arresting people, and the murders went on. And these were particularly brutal murders that went on year after year after year. Well, in the 1980s, this young, tenacious Soviet policeman went to his superiors and said, I think it's one man. I think we have a killer, and I think it's one man. And they said, no. That's heresy. And they refused to admit, and he tried year after year after year, and he kept begging his superiors. He knew that the FBI had a forensic psychiatry that gave profiles, or that has started developing profiles to work as a blueprint to catch serial killers. And they wouldn't let him do it until 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and this young detective got permission to contact the FBI, and the FBI worked with him, and they caught Andrei Chikatilo in November of 1990. So I was aware of this when I was in the summer of 1990, when I first started going to Belarus. I was aware of the Butcher of Rostov. I mean, it was, things that people would whisper, especially women, because they felt very vulnerable. And he was caught that fall, November of 1990, and it was due to the persistence of one very brave detective, police sergeant. So I've added all of these elements into Black Wolf. It is fiction, but if you read it, you'll see the Planeta Hotel, you'll see the women that work there, you'll see the scientists, you'll see the Iranian bad agents who come in and try to acquire this. And it's all based on truth. Some of the timing is different. Again, I was never interviewed by the KGB, fortunately. Poor Melvina is. And so the big mystery in Black Wolf is, of all of these suspects, who is the Svislov strangler? No plot spoilers, but it will be revealed at the end who the serial killer is and was. I picked this picture because picking mushrooms is almost a religious experience in Russia. Russian people go out, it's a time for family, they have picnics, it's a way to commune with nature. Unfortunately, in Belarus, we found out fairly soon after arriving was that Chernobyl, which happened in 1986, irradiated 80% of Belarus. It irradiated more of Belarus than even Ukraine. And there still is now what's called the exclusion zone, which is the northern part of Ukraine, the southern part of Belarus, which is off limits. People still go and pick mushrooms there because that's where they grow. They seem to thrive well on radiation. So, we were there, and of course we were eating the food and breathing the air, and we wore dosimeters that would be checked every time. I was 2 weeks there, 2 weeks home, checked dosimeters, and usually, I never went to the exclusion zone, but usually it would read like I'd had a couple of x-rays. That was about the level of radiation, which over time could be deadly. And you think about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where he pulled 1,000 troops across the exclusion zone, took over Chernobyl. They're churning up all this dust. They're digging trenches so that sometime in the near or far future, 1,000 men are going to be affected by the radiation. So it's something that's going to be there for 10,000 years. In the book, again, no plot spoilers, but I've had several people have read the book and said, I don't know if I can ever eat mushrooms again. Because I've conflated this beautiful pastoral pastime of picking mushrooms and the serial killer. And it's like, oh, I don't know. But anyway, that being said, it was an incredible experience that I felt so fortunate to be able to be a part of. I was very proud to be a part of the CTR program. Again, 1990 to 1998, in and out of Belarus and Kazakhstan. I haven't been back to the former Soviet Union since 1998. Now I certainly would be hesitant to go back. But I think our eyes are pointed towards the threat that Russia poses. And I've seen several authors like David McCloskey and Almakatsu writing traditional Soviet spy novels again. So for good or for bad, we're back in Jean Le Carré's territory. So anyway, I will stop here and take some questions if anybody has any questions. Yes?
Did you have any pleasant surprises while you were there?
Well, yeah, the vodka was ever present. Vodka, they kept the price of vodka low. You would pay the equivalent of about 25 cents for a bottle of vodka. When you get the bottle of vodka, it would have a foil cap, because once you opened it, you're not going to close it again, right? It was considered bad manners not to finish the bottle. So once we gained the people's trust, we went to people's homes, the scientists that worked in the Heat and Mass Transfer Institute, and Bill Bagel, of course, was everybody's best friend, and he spoke the language, and so we'd go to different people's houses, and they make a toast, and you're supposed to drink after everybody makes a toast. One of my colleagues, Harvey Polikoff, who was a scientist from the US side, would very surreptitiously switch his water for my vodka, and he kept me probably from going to the hospital. One story that I'll tell that was kind of a funny surprise. We went to Oleg Martinenko. Oleg Martinenko was the head of the Heat and Mass Transfer Institute that we worked a lot through in Belarus, and I write about this in Black Wolf. So Oleg's house, this beautiful pre-war building, a gorgeous apartment, because he was a very high-ranking member of the Politburo. And we had dinner, and it was during the summertime, and he had a dasha, and he had fresh vegetables, and so we had a very nice dinner. And so his apartment was just across the alley from the KGB building. It was like a little narrow alley, and there were his dining room windows. And so I stepped up to the window, and I'm standing there looking, and I realized that directly across, maybe, 40 feet across from me is a KGB officer with binoculars staring straight at me. And I said, what do I do? So I kind of looked around and I waved like that. And then his hand crept up, he looked around and went like that. So just those little human moments that, look, we didn't get warm and fuzzy with the KGB, and that sort of dissipated over time. The Belarus declared its sovereignty in 1990, but it declared its independence the next year in 1991. And so it became fully independent. But it was years and years before they could sort of break the back of the Soviet Politburo. It was really ingrained in them. So, anybody else? Yes?
Was your mission from 90 to 98 successful? Did you get a lot of stuff out of it?
Yes and no. We had to deal with a lot of things that were out of our control, like the mafia. The Bratva was very active. We stopped traveling. Initially, we had to fly from Frankfurt to Moscow to Minsk, because everything went through Moscow. But by 1991, almost every week, some American or Western businessman was being kidnapped and held for ransom by the Bratva. And so we had a lot of things sabotaged, it just made things difficult. But the CTR program was still active until I think 2012. And 3/4 of the nuclear weapons had been dismantled. Now, who knows since, what was it, 2014 that Crimea was invaded? So that we don't know. We have no boots on the ground to tell us how effective the CTR program continued to be. But up until that point, there were officially 3/4 of the nuclear weapons had been dismantled. So I think Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar probably did more to keep us safe. They're the unsung heroes of post-Cold War history. And if they hadn't jumped into the breach, who knows, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, who knows who would have gotten their hands on nuclear weapons. So I think they did an incredible job. Yes?
Were the weapons stored in different countries or different areas of Russia?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Were the weapons stored in different countries?
Yes.
Different areas.
Yes, they were all across the Soviet Union. Stalin was so paranoid that, for example, in Kazakhstan, all of the submarine parts and the shell casing for the torpedoes were made in Kazakhstan, which was, 6,000 miles away from the Barents Sea, because he was afraid if he centralized his weapons manufacturing, someone would stage a coup and take it all away from him. So there were most of the nuclear weapons were in Russia. Then the second country was Belarus, and then Ukraine. So it was primarily the countries that were the westernmost, abutting Western Europe. But collectively, as I said, 27,000, which is an alarming number. I will say that Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was president for 30 years, was probably the most collaborative with the US government and opened up all of the doors and said, come in, help us, because he wanted engagement with the West. And he knew this was the key to get it. Russia was the most difficult. They were very secretive. They would constantly delay, and they were really difficult. I didn't work in Russia, and I'm really glad, because that would have been, I think that was much more difficult. Yeah. So the question was, did I talk to any of the former government employees? Unfortunately, a lot of them have passed on. One thing I did, which I wasn't supposed to do, because I had security clearance, I kept a diary, I kept a journal. And I wrote it mostly in Gregg shorthand. Now, backing up, going to UT when my father talked me out of being a writer and changing my subject to business, at that time, in 1971, back when they were lighting classrooms with whale oil lamps, the only way you could get a business degree if you were a woman was you had to take typing and shorthand. I took Gregg shorthand, and I got proficient at it. And I would use it. And when I would travel to the former Soviet Union, I took all the notes in Gregg shorthand nobody knew. The Americans, the Russians, it could have been Sanskrit. No one knew what I was writing. And I could write, death to, Gorbachev or whatever. And which reminds me of a joke. I'm going to tell you another joke that KGB agent told me. So a KGB agent and a CIA agent were talking about, who had the best intelligence agency. And the CIA agent said, I could stand in front of the White House and yell, "I hate George Bush," and nothing would happen to me. And the KGB said, okay. I could stand in front of the Kremlin and yell, "I hate George Bush too," and nothing would happen to me. Another KGB joke. So anyway, but I kept the journal, which I was really glad that I did, because Lowell Mintz and I are the only two remaining of our original group that went to Belarus. Everybody else is gone. Bill Begel's gone. So I'd forgotten so many details, what it smelled like, what the food tasted like, what my fears were, what the people looked like. Going to these little out-of-the-way places. I'm really glad that I did, and that it wasn't confiscated at the end of my tenure there. Yes. Oh, okay. I'll take this one, and then I'll take you. Yes.
This church, for about the duration of the 90s, had a program called the Russia Initiative, in which we had a sister or brother city. Ours happened to be one called Saratov in the southern part of Russia. My point is, we went 6 times, and after the first time, flying back, I said to myself, how could such sweet people as we just met, and such nice people as we think we are, point nuclear weapons at each other for 50 years? I'm thinking that we didn't meet any bad people. We met nice people, hospitable people, loving people.
Yes.
I wonder if you had the same experience.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because the people, I've lost track of many of them, but they were very warm, giving, loving people. I mean, some of the greatest music and literature and dance comes from the former Soviet Union. And I used this little episode and I put it in the book it was an exchange between Melvina and the first time she meets the Black Wolf. And it was based on an experience that I had. We were hosting a Belarusian delegation in New York, and Stanislav Bril was the deputy prime minister at the time. He had come over, we were hosting him, and it was a cocktail party. We were standing around, and I was using my really bad Russian, and he was using his really bad English. We were trying to communicate. And there was a tape player in the back playing kind of soft pop music. And all of a sudden, the song, and some of you may know it, Sting from the Police wrote a song called Russians. And the verse is, I hope the Russians love their children too. And it's about the Cold War, and we're going to destroy each other. Don't we care about our children? So in the orchestral interlude in this piece of music is Prokofiev from Lieutenant Kriege. It's Prokofiev, and it's very And he stopped, and he said, "That's Prokofiev." And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, why Prokofiev's in this pop song?" And he said, "Who's singing?" And I said, "Sting." And he said, "Oh, Sting, you mean like me?" I said, "Yeah, like me." And he said, "Well, what are the words?" And I said, "Well, he's talking about the Cold War and the threat of nuclear winter." And the verse is, "I hope the Russians love their children too." And he was so shocked. He said, "Of course we love our children. Why wouldn't we love our children? We love our children as much as anyone else." And so it was that disparity, that disconnect between governments holding the world hostage and parents, grandparents, people, human beings living and working and just trying to feed their kids and live in peace. And it made such an impression on me because I think both of us realized that we had come at several points closer than maybe any of us ever really fully understand how close we've come to nuclear disaster, many times over the last 40 years or so. So they're people like everyone else, warm and giving, and so it was really wonderful. Yeah, I think there was a gentleman, yes?
Is it true that Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees? And what are the details in that?
Well, it was all, the incentive was investment in their infrastructure. And the security that they got, the guarantees that they got, were if they would work with U.S. civilian contractors and convert weapons manufacturing plants to civilian use, they'd be given money. It was an incentive. And they were desperate for it. Now, sometimes it wasn't cash, sometimes they were goods. Sometimes, we helped in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, we helped provide the military with food, tents, and cots. Because the military, they weren't being paid. They were starving like everyone else. So we helped defray that by providing some infrastructure. Some of the telecom companies like AT&T were in there really early trying to, It was an odd marriage because the commercial marketplace does not fit well with the Department of Defense. It takes 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And, in business, sometimes you have to make very snap decisions. And so it was this odd thing. And then also you had, we had to deal with Russian, kind of a laissez-faire attitude about things. And dealing with the mafia. So it was very complex, and it was an ever-changing atmosphere. It was always something new and surprising that we had to deal with. But all of the independent, and it was first Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia, because that's where a lot of the weaponry was. They were given incentives to convert missile production. In other words, for example, in Belarus, there was a laser guidance system manufacturing facility that we dismantled and converted to making laser pointers. So, but we paid the workers while they were doing that so that they could survive. And then the plan was to then step back and let them continue on as a commercial enterprise. That part of it didn't always go so well because they were used to the communist system. They didn't know how the commercial marketplace worked. So, it was by fits and starts. So, yes.
Did you leave by your own occasion, or did they remove you from that area?
I'm sorry, say that again? Oh, or did they fire me? I was, by 1998, after 8 years in and out of Belarus and Kazakhstan, I was exhausted. And I had just adopted a son. And traveling, I realized that I couldn't travel the way I was, and I was so burnt out, and I was so exhausted. The uncertainty, the frustration, and, a couple of members of our team that spent a lot of time in Belarus came down with thyroid cancer. I mean, there was that cloud of, would I get sick? And so I excused myself. I spent another 2 years in New York as project manager, but I didn't travel anymore. I stayed in New York. So yeah, they didn't fire me. I quit. One more. Okay.
It does? Oh, now it does.
I was in Belarus in 1989, and the day that I spent in Katyn was perhaps the most deeply spiritual and emotional experience of my life.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could tell them a little bit more about the site, including the chimneys and the bells and the birch tree, et cetera.
Yeah. The entire memorial is, as you said, symbolic, and it's incredibly moving. Where the original homesteads were, they put up like chimney structures with bells inside, and they would ring the bells every hour. And there was one chimney for each house that was there. There was a concrete bunker where the barn was that was incinerated. They had the three birch trees. If I remember correctly, it was for the 3 million Belarusians that died. They had this monument with 183, and I think that was for the 183 villages that couldn't be salvaged after the war. So everything had a meaning, and it is a very somber place. It is a very spiritual place, but it was jarring to have this Belarusian scientists tell me, it wasn't just the Germans; it was Belarusians that were working with the Germans. But it's a lovely place. It really is. So, thank you all. До свидания. Thank you.
Kathleen, thank you.
Thank you.
3 quick things. 1, see, my hatred for mushrooms is based on science. 2, Kathleen, again, in her books will be upstairs. And 3, next week, Dave Lieber is going to come and tell us all about Amon Carter. Have a good week. See you next week.